Episode 8.
I have to hold up I'm not great with numbers.
Clearly. Welcome everybody to episode 8 of Pithy Musings. What do we put the funk into, Miss Eva?
We put the funk into being human.
We sure do. So episode 8, it's going to be a good one. I have a sense. We're talking about the imposter experience. There's a reason we're not going to call it a syndrome, which we'll get into in a bit. But really the question that we're asking of each other is the imposter experience a real thing? Mm-hmm. So before we do that, why don't we introduce ourselves? Eva, you want to go first?
Indeed. I am Eva Van Krugel. I am with Fervor Leadership Coaching and Consulting, and I am in the Pacific Northwest.
Oh, okay.
I threw in location.
Okay, I love it. And I am Carolyn Berglund, principal of Talk Talk, and I am in the mountains of Calgary, Alberta, Canada. And I'm rocking, for those that are wondering what shirt I'm wearing, it says good vibes. I'm sending good vibes to you, Eva, as we enter into this episode 8. I'm sending good vibes to our viewers, listeners, watchers. We want to start this episode by once again extending our appreciation for all those that spend the time with us in these episodes. We know they're long.
To make them shorter. I think I declared in our last one we're going to make it shorter, and then it ended up being like an hour and 12 minutes.
It was the longest. It was the longest one. We just get very excited. So our last episode was, I think, quite interesting in the sense that it spurred us to go into someone else's podcast. So The episode was called Why Are We So Afraid of Conflict? We talked a lot about psychological safety and trust and how that is somehow part of that. And then we were reached out by a lovely, generous woman by the name of Nicole Bendelay. Her podcast is called Leading with Purpose, so go check it out. And we mused as guests on her podcast. How was that experience for you?
A shout out to Nicole. Again, another person out there in the world who's leading the way in a lot of work inside of organizations, and developing teams and leaders for healthier systems and so on. And she was so generous of spirit in saying, meet Carolyn, meet Eva. They each do these things. They represent these companies. And they also have their own podcast. So if you haven't heard it, listen to it. And I was like, way to model collaboration versus competition and supporting and lifting one another up. After all, the more of us who can be doing some of that work, the better. We're not in competition. We're doing it together and more powerful together. So I loved her welcome and her generous promotion. Just meant the world.
Well, and to kick off our topic around being an imposter, I don't know about you, because we didn't really talk about this. I was like, she wants us on her podcast? What are we going to talk about? But it actually reminded me, and I was telling you in advance of us recording, that I went back and watched Pithy Musings episode 1. Who am I anyways?
Yeah.
And I remember being pretty nervous in advance of that first episode. And part of it was around, well, what do I have to say? Does anybody want to listen to me? Like, who are we to think that we can let's just go do a video podcast. Hopefully we'll get some viewers.
Well, and naturally, I want to know how What have you learned since then? This is episode 8.
Yeah.
So how's the experience for you since that first one?
Well, yeah, and we do it once a month, so it's been 8 months. It is so comfortable now.
Mhm.
So it's really about firsts. Like I think about the last year in particular for me, resurrecting Talk, how many firsts I've had. And oftentimes in those firsts, you kind of question, like, am I equipped to do this? So now it's quite comfortable because we've done so many. And even if we were invited onto someone else's podcast, it would be much more comfortable. And I likely wouldn't have some of those question marks because I've done it once.
So do you think that and in those firsts, I'm totally with you. Do you think that every time you've been through firsts before?
Yeah.
And so what do you remind, like if somebody was confronting a first, may not have the imposter experience full on, but may have some self-doubt, what would you pass along to them?
Yeah, I think it's about comfort zone. So I am of the belief, so comfort zone, just defining comfort zone, it's, anything outside of your regular, right? It's when you get those little butterflies. It's when you're in your comfort zone, you wake up at 7, you drive to the office, you say hi to the same person, you have lunch with the same people, you do a couple of meetings, nothing feels uncomfortable. I actually believe that all new learning happens outside of your comfort zone. So for those that are facing a first, it's okay. It's just uncomfortable. That's all.
Yeah.
And push yourself to do that and ask the question, like, what's the worst that can happen?
Yeah, I find too, just reminding ourselves that, hey, I've faced some firsts before and I got through them.
Yeah.
I survived them. And maybe I didn't even just survive them. Maybe I did an okay job or a really great job. So I just always try to remind myself, if I'm in a first and I confront a little bit of, ooh, what am I doing here? I just remind myself of that. And I kind of take comfort in that. And then I just go for it without overthinking it. And I find that sort of self-questioning or nervousness starts to sort of dissipate. But
the truth is that you're nobody's alone in having this experience. Like I saw a stat this morning in preparation for this episode that said 82% of people have experienced what they're calling perceived fraudulence, which is just another term for imposter experience or imposter syndrome. 82%.
Yeah. But so this is one of the things that it gets me thinking about some of the self-compassion tenets. And it makes me think about common humanity from Dr. Kristin Neff, that there are more of us that have a common experience than sometimes we realize. And we don't have to sit in isolation in our self-doubt. That you and I, right before these episodes, we always have a good chin wag and a few laughs, and we dance in our chairs and all of that.
I love that you say chin wag.
Yeah, our little chin wags. And
those sessions should be recorded too, because you're pretty funny.
Oh no, we crack each other up, and we literally do dance in our chairs as a little bit of a warm up. And but where was I going there? Chin wag?
I don't know.
Oh, self-compassion. And one of the tenets from Kristin Neff, common humanity, and that we're not in it alone. We don't have to sit in isolation. And that's another really great reminder I find, and also working with some of my clients or friends, family, so on. You're not the only person that's been through this. We're actually more in this together than we think.
Well, let me just add to that and say, I did a Google search on imposter syndrome experience, whatever you want to call it, phenomena. And it yielded more than 5 million results.
Yeah.
So in addition to that, I'm like, well, let me think, who kind of demonstrates this notion of imposter experience? And let me just define it for our viewers.
Yeah, please.
So imposter syndrome was actually first known as imposter phenomena in 1970s by a psychologist, Suzanne Imes and Pauline Clance, though it is mostly known incorrectly. That's why I think it's important to highlight this as imposter syndrome. Clance told Harvard social psychologist Amy Cuddy, we know Amy, in her book Presence, that she'd not called it imposter phenomenon if she could do it all over again. I would call it the imposter experience, she said, because it's not a syndrome or a complex or mental illness. It's something almost everyone experiences. So if you look into like psychiatry, it's not a diagnosis. No. So I would suggest for those listening and watching, remove that word syndrome and replace it with experience.
Yeah, I thank you for that distinction. And we're seeing more conversation around it, that early in the 70s, I believe, in some of my rummaging around, that it was more skewed towards women.
Yes.
Being a syndrome. And yet the more, as I was researching and preparing for today's conversation too, I kind of wanted to challenge what I think I know around it too, because I'm hearing when I'm working with clients, say one-on-one, the number of people who self-diagnose with imposter syndrome, and it transcends gender.
Yeah,
it's men and it is women, or those who identify as another entity.
Correct.
We are seeing it just across the board. It's not my place to say you have imposter syndrome, but they still see it as a syndrome versus an experience that we can move through, or we can learn how to move through when it pops up its ugly head.
I wonder though, as you're talking about kind of both genders, I wonder if it's more heavily skewed on the female population. So why I'm going to say that is, okay, geeking out. Back in the 18th and 19th century, doctors would often diagnose women with a term by the name of female hysteria. And what that meant was it was an alleged mental condition that explained away any behaviors or symptoms that made men uncomfortable. So right?
I'm having to really, I laugh in my discomfort.
Right?
Like that whole thing. And I'm sitting here really trying to self-manage and not have judgment. But
I wonder if imposter syndrome might have been a hangover from that legacy and more heavily skewed on that female community. I would conjecture, and I don't have any statistics, I'm not a physician, I don't know, but I would guess that men probably don't suffer to the same degree as women. I don't know.
And I really don't know. And I if anybody listening, watching has perspectives, thoughts, experiences, knowledge, references, share them in comments. This is about learning for every single one of us, and for Carolyn and I really don't know, because I would say of whatever gender or entity one associates with, anyone that I'm working with seems to bring forward an element of self-doubt or self-declared imposter syndrome.
And I think it's in all facets of the world, right? If you think about famous people.
Oh,
Sheryl Sandberg.
Sure.
I don't know if you've read her book, Lean In.
Sure.
So she's the CEO of Facebook. She says, and every time I didn't embarrass myself, or even if I excelled, I believed that I fooled everyone yet again. One day soon, the jig would be up. Like, look at this woman, highly successful. Other famous people, Lady Gaga has been known as having the imposter experience. Tom Hanks, and the last one I'll quote from is Tina Fey, who I love.
Yeah, she's right.
The beauty of imposter syndrome is you vacillate between extreme egomania and a feeling of, I'm a fraud. Oh God, they're on to me. I'm a fraud.
Yeah. There's a part of me, it's almost like my intuition wants to say, I do think that women, may experience it more or have more of a history, or is it that we talk about it more, or is it, I don't know. What I have noticed as you're sharing is there are these books that seem to attract a lot of female readers or are written for women. For example, Tara Mohr's Playing Big.
Yep.
Practical wisdom for women who want to speak up, create, and lead. A huge part of this book is around understanding and navigating your inner critic.
Mm.
And the inner critic, there's this beautiful quote in here too. It's funny, in my own notes, I wrote, the inner critic assumes versus being curious, focuses on problems versus solutions, speaks with an anxious versus calm tone, speaks from a stance of self-criticism versus one of self-support. The list goes on. Here's a really interesting quote. And I'm curious about your response, Jet. And I also wonder about men or other gender associations who would respond to this, because is it just about women, or is there some sort of common humanity in this? So many women find their inner critic speaks up most loudly around their most deeply felt dreams for their lives and work, because we feel particularly vulnerable about them. They experience the most panicky, overwhelming self-doubt when they are moving toward what they truly long to do. The inner critic is like a guard at the edge of your comfort zone. Many women find that the more strongly the inner critic shows up, the louder and meaner and more hysterical its voice. The closer they are to a breakthrough, or the more likely they are to be on the edge of taking a very important step. In this sense, when you hear a major inner critic attack, you can often greet it as good news. It likely means you are playing bigger.
Yeah. At first, my reaction was, well, that's quite negative. And in my experience, so I'll tell you a story. So I think I was 29, and I spent the first 10 years of my career in consumer packaged goods sales. So that's just really a fancy way of saying anything in a grocery store. And I had the opportunity, I was in Calgary, and I was with this organization, and my leader at the time could sense that I was kind of getting a bit bored. I don't know, I think I'd only been in that role for a year, but anyway, so what came across his desk was a posting internally for a global sales role. And because he was a great leader, he said, hey, would you like to apply for this? It has nothing to do with my region. You'd be reporting to this office in New Jersey. Do you want to apply? And I said, yeah, I do. Now, there were candidates throughout the world, like within the company world. And I went to New York City and went through a series of interviews. It was probably, as I reflect, one of the most daunting experiences ever. I think I had 8 or 10 interviews in one day with various leaders within the organization. And I got home, and a week later, I found out I got the job. And I remember going, what? Like, I was just happy I got a trip to New York. What? How did I get this job? So that's that inner critic attack. Like, who am I? Right?
Yeah.
But what the reverse happened was, and I found this to be kind of a pattern for me in my life, is to say, well, I'm going to figure it out. Mm-hmm. So there's the positive side of that imposter experience. I'm going to figure it out. I'm going to work really hard to figure it out.
Did you always feel that way, that you'll figure it out? Or was that something that you learned over time that lends to your confidence?
I do think that that's part of my makeup. I can't think of a time where I was devastatingly in that inner critic attack for long periods of time. Yeah. I think candidly, that's the truth. How about for you?
I relate to that experience too. I've been blessed enough to, there's a flip side to it too. I've been blessed to not get into the grip for extended periods of time. At the same time, I think I've also been, raised, cultured, socialized right, wrong, I don't know, to push forward. And no matter what I'm faced with, that, you can do anything. And so very much an influence of achieve, go achieve, get a better grade, play even better, play that harder song in a recital, push yourself. You can always do better. Now, as I say that out loud, I mean, that has for sure that drive to achieve and do better next time, while also celebrating. There was also certainly celebration of, hey, I was never good at math, for example, in school.
Me neither.
What I really love is that, but here's the thing, I was never strong at math, yet, into my, like in the first 5 years of my early career, I was managing multi-million-dollar budgets using Excel flawlessly.
Well, let's not even get into that topic, because it's how it was taught, at least for me, is
Yeah.
why I didn't get math. And then anyway.
Yeah, no, like it just not good at it. So anyways, so I was pushed to achieve. Yep. And so the flip side of that is, later on in life, I've had to figure out, why am I so burnt out? And why is good enough not good enough? And, I've had to do lots of self-work around that. And I now have the gift of working with people who are confronting the same things. And so that gets me to the point around, where does this come from? And why are so many people experiencing the imposter experience? And I think there's a spectrum between, moments of self-doubt to spiraling and being in the grip and being completely hijacked.
I think you're so right on so many fronts there. But the first that really resonates with me is, and for our viewers, listeners, and watchers, is that how you grow up has an implication as around imposter experience and expectations. I think one of the things that we're seeing right now too, to add to that, is this generation that needs 2, 3, 4 degrees. Like, why do you need these additional letters behind your name? Because you think that you're not quite ready to enter into the workforce, that you need to go and get another?
Yeah.
Like, I'm confused by that.
Yeah, there's a really interesting paradoxical relationship between self-development,
yes,
self-acceptance.
Correct.
And I would thank Dr. Dan Harrison for that paradoxical finding of those two traits. Credit.
It's very different than being autodidact, which we've talked about before, which is the self-learner and learning for the sheer pleasure of learning, as opposed to, I need these letters so I can show others. It reminds me of like Keeping Up with the Joneses. It's social media driven, where we're looking at these people and they, we were talking about it in advance of this, plastic surgery, and, oh, maybe I need to do that so that I can be as beautiful, whatever beauty we however we define it.
I love that you're bringing that up. You were going to finish a thought and I interrupted.
No, go.
I love that you're bringing that up. We literally just had a conversation around image awareness and image consciousness. And as, I'm going to say it, 2 middle-aged women.
Yeah.
Where there are the influences of, you should go get that facial consult, and you can go and get that facial consult. And then they tell you that you need to go, do this and do this. And then, put all these needles all over your face and 2 weeks of like swollen repair, and
can I just say what is really bizarre for those people out there that have ever had a consult? The person, either a physician or otherwise, will look at you and stare at your face for an inordinate amount of time, which is very uncomfortable, looking for imperfection. And so one of the things I think you and I have talked about is, well, why? What is wrong with the wrinkle, with the jowl, with the what's?
Well, it's so because it also does tie into the imposter experience of do I belong? Do I and lack of self-acceptance, lack of self-love. And so some of us, I remember going and having this consult, and I got in the car and I looked in the, and I end up with some sort of massive diagnosis. And I'm like, what the is this? Honestly, I look at the
diagnosis.
Yeah, and I'm looking in the mirror and tilting it. I've got the light on, and I'm like, I didn't know that I was that bad. I didn't, right? And then I literally got home. I think it may have, I don't know, I probably poured myself a glass of wine at like,
not Scotch,
12 noon. And I took this piece of paper and I literally just, I was like, I'm shredding this and I'm putting this in the recycling.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's like, there's all these puzzle pieces to imposter syndrome. And one of them is keeping up with the Joneses, however we want to look at that. Like, you know, it's kind of, you know, we're laughing at it. I'm actually laughing till I'm crying, but it's a bit sad, isn't it?
Well, and it also, yes. And I also want to make sure and highlight whoever chooses to, whatever they need to do to feel good for whatever reasons, go
100%. No judgment at all.
You want to go and do what you need to do it. You know, am I still thinking about microdermabrasion and, you know, sure. Whatever. I just want to feel good and be healthy. We've talked about that too. So what are you okay with? What are you not okay with when it's rooted in self-love?
Yes.
Versus external expectation, validation. Yeah. And if we can, we'll get into the self-love stuff. The other thing about the self-development thing that you brought up, it's reminding me of these 5 types of imposter syndrome, which I found super fascinating in preparation for this conversation. 5 types of imposter syndrome from Dr. Valerie Young. Really neat article on themuse.com. So she talks about the perfectionist.
Yep.
You know, good enough isn't good enough. It always has to be perfect. The superwoman, which I would add Superman or superhuman or super entity, whatever somebody identifies with, but the superhuman, which is like the full-on chronic hyperachiever, constantly hustling. The natural genius. So these are the ones that are like lifelong learners, and recognize that we're a work in progress, but A+ have come pretty easily.
Yeah.
The soloist, I don't need help from anybody. Asking for help is a weakness. And imagine the impact on others if we impose that. Then there's the expert, which is constantly on the hunt for self-development to feel you qualify and you are enough. So there's that paradox again on that one in particular, the expert, where we're hustling for the self-development, but where's our self-acceptance? And when is enough? So when I share all of those, have you had any moments in any of those 5?
You know what I'm doing is, as you're going through them, and I hadn't seen this before, is I'm like, oh, that's that person. Oh, that's that person. I could kind of see in others, but for sure, I think every one of those I've been at some point. No question. No question.
Yeah.
You know, I think that superwoman, superman, human one is an interesting one because it's about that extrinsic validation, which I think I've really worked hard at shedding. We've talked about that in around conflict, the episode around conflict. So it, you know, early in my career, you know, would work to garner accolade. Oh, I'm doing it right. I'm doing it right. I'm doing it right. And really didn't have a ton of intrinsic recognition. So I wouldn't pat myself on the back, where in the stage of life that I'm in right now, the extrinsic recognition, validation is important, but it's not everything. Actually, the stuff that's really important to me is my own internal dialogue around validation. Is there one that sticks out for you?
Similar to you, I can relate. I've definitely had experiences with each and every one of them. Again, I've had the gift of not getting completely suckered into a devastating and sometimes heavily derailing spiral of the imposter experience.
Yeah.
However, I've for sure struggled with, I wouldn't say, I have a hard time with the word perfectionism, but just for lack of a better way of saying it, like in positive intelligence, we'd call it a stickler.
Yeah.
And like one of my top scores, I'm sure that, clients listening to this will have a good laugh. Like, hello, recovering, full on recovery. And it's because I have very high standards, but it's been learning how to have, instead of 80% of my time, going for perfection, and 20% of the time being, that's good enough. 80% of the time, there's only so much of me to go around. So I'm just like, I can do the best I can in the time that I have with the resources I have access to. And good enough is actually very good.
Yeah.
And so so I do recognize there are a couple that are maybe a little more dominant, and I've found techniques, or the super, for sure identify, I have for sure been a superwoman. And I just learned, that also in positive intelligence would be the hyperachiever.
Mm-hmm.
Also one of my top scores. I've learned how to avoid super stressed achievement. If it's midnight and my eyes are ready to fall off of my face and I'm reading a paragraph for like the
18th time,
no progress, that would be a sign that I need to simmer down and get off my high horse. So now I'm better with energy management, prioritization, those kinds of things. And also I definitely soloist is one that also stands out. I used to think, oh, I can't ask for help. And now I'm like, spouse, I got a big day on Zoom today. Could you make me a smoothie?
Do you have your smoothie next to you?
No, it's coming. The order will be coming in hot in about 2 hours. But
okay.
Yeah, but even that, I would, even in an intimate relationship, I would have a hard time asking for what I needed because I can do it by myself. Again, where do these things
do it better?
Yes, for sure.
I can do it better.
Which can be rooted in control. But so again, where did these things come from? What do you think?
Well, I think it's all those things that we just talked about. It's how you're raised. I think that's a big part of it. I think it's what's going on in society, with social media. I think it's how you talk to yourself. It's how aware you are, how reflective you are with yourself. I think it's appropriate for us to dig into what are the definitive signs of the imposter experience.
Yes. Are you asking me or are you sharing?
I'm asking, but I'll kick it off. I think it's self-doubt, sense of incompetence, frequently comparing yourself to others, right? That jealousy stuff emerges. I think it's also when we talked about feedback that was the last episode, not what is conflict. Feedback was their last episode. What am I thinking about?
Oh, it was feedback. Conflict was the one before, but then,
Anyway, but thinking about that, if you have the imposter experience and you receive appreciation, you might candidly and authentically bark it down. No, that's good. Yeah. You did it way better than I did, or. So those are some of the signs of the imposter experience from my perspective. How about from your perspective?
Yeah, I would agree, and signs of constantly, as Brené Brown calls it, hustling for our worth.
Yeah. And
constantly seeking that external validation. When the core of the onion really starts with self. And when we get into some of how the heck do we overcome some of this stuff? We'll get into that in a little bit. So much of it comes down to self-love. Call it cliche, laugh, but anybody can laugh at me saying that. Well, of course, or well, how the hell do you get that if you are so riddled with the imposter experience?
I just want to pause you there because one of our loyal viewers, hello, Cora. I was having a chat with her and I was saying that this was the episode, and she highlighted self-care. So I just wanted to punctuate that because I think it starts there, right?
Well, and Tara Mohr, in her book, Playing Big, talks about, I think, are they communication shrinkers? So if we find ourselves going, oh, sorry about that, or sorry, or I have a really bad, this is probably just like a terrible idea, but I'm just going to put it out there.
Yeah.
Or we start a sentence with, actually, it's coming from a place of scarcity.
Well, and also about perhaps layering into fueling the, the imposter experience beast is if you are not in a psychologically safe environment. So in a psychologically safe environment, I'd say to you, no, I want to hear your idea. Go for it.
Yeah.
Right. So I didn't even think of that until just right now, is that in an unsafe environment, that beast of insecurity and self-doubt is going to be further perpetuated.
Well, so that gets into, the question for me around how do we create belonging in an environment that is, where do the two meet, where I stand in the power of who I am, and I have self-worth, I have self-love, and I belong. How do we
such a powerful word, belonging.
Oh,
we've never really talked about this.
Oh, I mean, there's a whole episode on belonging, and we're seeing folks literally launch businesses around belonging. Like one of the partners of a business now called Belongify.
Lauren Rubis. Yeah.
Right. And he is like, and good on him.
Yeah.
Bent on creating more belonging in systems at work and beyond. But how do you, I guess what I'm trying to get at is how do you find your sense of belonging and self-worth when the external environment is poking and tugging at you in psychologically unsafe ways?
Yeah.
I mean, the natural thing many of us might do, fight, flight, freeze.
Right. Yeah.
But what would you do?
Well, I've been there, right? I've been in, I worked for an organization where I used to say quite frequently to those that I trusted within that organization, one of these things just doesn't belong here. That's that Sesame Street song.
Yeah.
One of these things just doesn't belong here. Right. Yeah. And I felt like I didn't fit. I wasn't nurtured to be being not a, they all look the same. What I mean by that, they all thought the same. They all behaved the same. They all presented the same. They all had each other's back. God forbid you should have a different point of view and be acknowledged as, hey, this is great. You're still a part of, and you belong to this team still. No. You conform, or we're going to keep you off to the side. I mean, if you Google imposter syndrome and you go imposter syndrome pick, you'll see a bunch of different graphics that I think absolutely are a visual depiction of what I'm talking about, right? It's what I think I know and what I know versus what I know and what others know. So you're making yourself small. Yeah. So I went off on a tangent, but
no.
The function of that was, I definitely know what that feels like. And when you don't feel like you belong, you question yourself, that self-doubt emerges, and it's not healthy.
Well, and I wonder also some inquiry around, I'm noticing I don't feel I belong. I'm noticing these behaviors in myself. What do I own in this? And what do they own? Am I making shit up?
Yep.
Or am I having a real experience here where I need to draw a boundary and figure out a way to make myself safe? Or so, what's mine? what's theirs and what's my boundary in this? And whatever I own, what do I need to go and now do about that so that I can stand in my belonging? This also crosses over into something that I find quite pervasive, admittedly, with some of the women that I work with, where they work at more of the belonging and the self-love and the self-worth, and I am enough, and they do amazing, like they do great things. They're either entrepreneurs, they're leaders, senior leaders. They do great kick-ass things. I friggin' love these people. But there is this thing that comes in often, either with firsts, there's some self-doubt. Probably one of the most dominant things I notice is that they're so worried about what other people will think.
Yeah. Right.
This realm for you and I is a full-on really respect, want to respect listeners and viewers, and new and loyal. And at the same time, it's not that we don't care what people think, speaking for myself, but I kind of have to shed and let go of some people maybe I've known for years might think, wow, she's really out there. She's outrageous. That's fine.
Well, and it comes with what we talked about around Brené in whatever episode it was being in the arena. We're putting, we're out there. So I think people are going to have an opinion.
For sure. And I would say, go ahead and have your opinion, whatever it may be. I celebrate that you and I come into this arena because we're playing big.
Right.
It's not trying. But right. And it's not like we enter into these things going and, and post it onto the YouTube. Joking. But it's not like
recording.
I know we're recording. But it's not like we don't enter into this going, okay, here we go. I mean, we've grown more and more comfortable, but we're more comfortable also with courage, more comfortable with bravery, more comfortable with being who we are in the world. However, it's taken some self-work to be okay.
Absolutely. With and it's taken it as it relates to the Pithy Musings work. Mm-hmm. I mean, a trusting relationship.
Oh, definitely.
So can you imagine if you entered into this type of relationship where there was jealousy, self-doubt, whatever it was, it would be a completely different conversation. It would have to be a different conversation because I wouldn't feel comfortable to speak my truth. And I would imagine vice versa.
Oh, for sure. I think it goes back to this expression. I probably said it ages ago, but that expression, you've got to love who you are when you're with people. And I think there's love who you are in your own being and find mechanisms to do that and choose your people where you love who you are when you're with them, where you can totally be yourself.
Don't you find that I'm finding this, the older that I get, that as I become more clear on who I am, so this really is around confidence. So we're talking about confidence versus the imposter syndrome experience. That's like kind of the opposite, right? Yeah. So as I become more confident with myself, I also attract like-minded people. Not to get too woo-woo, but I think there's some universal component to that. Did you just drop a drink?
No.
Okay.
No, but I have dropped my pens twice.
Okay. Well, I couldn't tell. But I do think you start attracting like-minded energies. I believe that. And so with those like-minded energies, you feel more comfortable in being your authentic, confident self. It just happens. Mm-hmm. Now, if we had surrounded ourselves with a bunch of, people that had self-doubt and lacked true confidence, that would have an impact on us as well.
Mm-hmm. No, for sure. I do think, if we are but bodies of water, and we are but bodies of energy, and aren't we? And And I do literally think that as we develop and as we grow and we start to own our stories and claim who we are uniquely and start to feel good in that and accepting of that, I do think that we do have a tendency to attract other like energy, like minds and hearts. And it doesn't mean that we don't still have moments of self-doubt or self-questioning or facing firsts or discomfort.
Oh,
like it's because that gets to a piece around, does it ever go away? I do not think that it goes away. I think that it starts, instead of it being on fire, it can start to dim, and we learn to tame it. We tame the inner critic.
I immediately starts going the opposite way here. I wouldn't mind getting your feedback on this. So we talk about confidence. The opposite of confidence, one might say, is the imposter experience, but is it really? What's the difference between confidence and arrogance?
I'm so yearning to do like an improv skit right now.
Do it.
Well, for some reason, I think of arrogance as very ego-driven, very agenda-inspired, probably underneath it, fear-induced.
100%. That's where arrogance comes from.
Ding, ding,
It's
ding, ding.
fear. It's coming from a place of, I'm not enough, so I'm going to show the world I'm, all that. Mm-hmm. One of the things I saw in some of the articles that I was reading was the true opposite of imposter syndrome experience is something called the Dunning-Kruger effect. Look it up, watchers, listeners, if you're interested, but let me read to you what it is. Dunning-Kruger effect is when people with low ability mistakenly think their ability is much higher than it is and fail to recognize their own incompetence. Ever met anyone like that?
Well, and my gut tells me there's probably a correlation with some self-awareness inhibitors.
Oh, yeah.
And understanding of the impact of oneself on others. And I would also wonder if there's a correlation with those who may have narcissistic tendencies.
Yep. Deity complex.
Yep. Yeah. We've talked about some of that before.
Yep. Know a few of those.
It's funny. I've had some folks say, you guys have referenced things and I really want to know more about it. And so I suspect we'll have some feedback from a few people going, you guys were kind of edging towards something on deity complex and things and narcissism. Who knows? Maybe we'll do an episode on those things.
Yeah.
One of the things
but that Dunning-Kruger effect is one axis is confidence and the bottom axis is wisdom. So knowledge and experience. So I think just to go into the corporate world, we've been kind of talking about personal stuff and kind of more the human experience, but Pithy Musings, again, if this is your first episode, we really talk about the whole human experience in corporations and organizations, in the business world, at home, all of that. But I'm thinking about leaders. So we both play in the arena of leadership in our respective organizations. And there's many leaders that I've seen that are very much on this Dunning-Kruger effect, which have low ability, that think they have the ability, and they fail to recognize their own incompetence, and so cover it up in some capacity. There are organizations, and I'll get your perspective on this. There are some organizations that I've worked with in the past that tenure equals promotion.
Yeah.
So the longer that you're there, well, you've been in that role 20 years, we gotta, get you to the next rung on the hierarchy, which is ridiculous. You're promoting incompetence into a higher role.
Well,
And then they have, all this influence in the organization.
yes. And yes. And yes. And another, parallel, sort of another way of framing it would be, we see a lot of people who are technically brilliant in their spaces, and they get promoted because they understand the business of things, and may not be as attuned to, like we see people skyrocket into executive level roles who aren't necessarily equipped with the skill set or mindset to nurture teams and people and relationships.
Yeah, they have the technical aptitude to do whatever role. They get promoted because of that technical aptitude. And then they get there with very little soft skills, as you call them, hard skills. And they're leading people.
So I find some of those maybe you relate to this too, will knock on your door.
Yes.
Will knock on my door going, I just had a brutal performance review where I had a 360 and my team's really struggling. Or someone finally going, the truth is, I just keep taking on these jobs and I don't feel equipped. And I'm really I don't like leading people. And I'm like, fascinating. So, and then sometimes they'll come out the other end. Maybe we'll work together for a year. They'll come out the other end going, I freaking love leading people. Or they'll go, it's not an area that I want to be doing, that I enjoy doing. I can get by doing it, but I don't want to do it.
And I just want to be, I want to be an individual contributor. So that's okay.
Yeah. And totally. But the fraud feeling dissipates with more self-knowing on where their strengths lie and what they also love doing.
Well, it's, in the leadership work that I do, I always start with a module, a phase around inner reflection. And oftentimes that's supported by assessment. So you were talking about positive intelligence. You were talking about, forgive me, Valerie Young. You were talking, all of these are about, and we've talked about assessments a lot on these episodes, are again, to look inward so that we can self-identify some of this stuff, including self-doubt and things that are around the imposter experience.
Yeah, where do you self-identify? Where do you self-identify? We could list off the 5 types from Dr. Valerie Young. Which one do you connect most in with? Or, what are your top 2? And then once we can dig into some of that self-awareness, what are some scenarios when it shows up? What do you want it to be instead of where it is now? And what might be some positive alternatives? And going out into the world and experimenting with them. One thing I want to make sure and touch on is, why do we think that this topic is important to touch on in the first place? Why did it light your fire to dig into it together?
Because I think it's a real pain point for people. And it's one that doesn't get a lot of attention. Although, the Google searches are 5 million and these famous people have talked about having this, I don't think people feel like it's acceptable to talk about within their own sphere of influence, right? Imagine showing up to work and saying to your boss, I feel like I'm an imposter here. It should be a comfortable conversation so that you can, try to move through it together. But I don't think it's readily talked about with people within your own little world in an intimate way. I don't think it's talked about. And people, I think, are hungering to try to figure out what to do about it, because it doesn't feel very good, Eva. If you're coming into every day with this self-doubt, you can't take appreciation. You're really resistant to constructive criticism as well. Oh yeah. Because, oh God, that's going to, none of that feels good. So I think there is an appetite to figure out what to do about it.
Yeah, I think it's, and I also think to our earlier discussion on belonging, I think by addressing it and understanding it and knowing how to tame it, knowing that we're not alone, and knowing how to tame it we can have strength and belonging. We can strengthen our self-worth. We can contribute in new and more powerful, impactful ways in the world. And we feel more grounded in purpose, why we're even here to begin with. So, and I'm with you. It's this taboo topic that, as coaches will hear about it, mentors may hear about it, counselors and therapists will hear about it. Well, if it's such a common experience, what is the shame in being able to say to a colleague or a leader, to be honest, I haven't done this before. It makes me feel a little unsettled. I'll figure it out. But the truth is, it makes me feel a little insecure. What's the worst thing that could happen?
Yeah. Yeah. And you know what? We're all human beings living a human experience. And if you approach your leader with that kind of proclamation, Eva, and it's met with resistance, that's likely not the leader for you. That's a big, bold statement, but it's true. Most people, I would say, if you went to them with the proclamation in which you've just stated, would go, let's talk about that. My goodness, okay, sit down. Let's have a conversation, because this is what I see.
Yeah. And it could transfer into, asking for help, or where do I begin? Or here's, and almost like a collaborative ideation on what's possible to equip that person and further the relationship that it could harvest.
Yes.
So, and the interesting thing is too, I've noticed, is that it transcends, I think we briefly touched on this, the imposter experience, moments of it, or deep dives into it. It can happen it doesn't matter how much money you have in the bank. It doesn't matter what level you're at in an organization. The number of C-level executives, EVP, just executives that go, oh my gosh, I got the job, and now what?
I'm going to be found out, right?
Yeah. So yeah, it's happening all over. So no, thank you for indulging in that. Why does this even matter in the first place? And in terms of self-identification, one of the things I also really love is, here comes the book.
I don't have any books. Gifts of Imperfection. That's Brené Brown. Okay.
Yeah. And one of the things I Googled was, where does it come from? And we often see that it can come from the family of origin that is pushing for achievement and pushing for high standards that leads to perfectionism. So Gifts of Imperfection is written for anyone. Let go of who you think you're supposed to be and embrace who you are. Your guide to a wholehearted life. So when we think about here's a quote from her that I have to read that I really love. We can only belong when we offer our most authentic selves and when we're embraced for who we are. But ultimately, that starts with ourselves. And so she has these 10 guideposts for wholehearted living. So, I'll give you an example. I even have it up on my wall. Little sticky note, there's scribbles all over it. And there's these 10 guideposts. And on the left, it's the things to let go of. And on the right, it's the things to cultivate as their antidotes. And so, where are you in this? And so letting go of, and then each chapter walks you through each of the guideposts. So letting go of what people think, perfectionism, numbing and powerlessness, scarcity and fear of the dark, letting go of the need for certainty, comparison, exhaustion as a status symbol. And
right. Can you just pause there? Because this is the new.
This is gold, Jerry.
This is the new F word, which is when you ask someone, how are you doing? I'm so busy. I'm so busy. What happened where we've lost the ability to, everybody's busy, but it becomes a status symbol to kind of out busy the next person. So you keep
It's
on freezing. That's why I keep on toggling my
I'm
screen
so
here.
sorry about the freeze action. Gosh, I know. No, you're managing it very, very well.
Thank you.
I want you to know.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, but I think that that's also, there's a hyper achieving culture out there that is where we pat each other on the back. People are incentivized or recognized in various ways for that high achievement and doing more and constant accomplishment. And so a big part of it, I think, is also our environment and the choices that we're making in it. And there's a couple of others in here in terms of letting go of anxiety as a lifestyle, letting go of self-doubt and supposed to, and letting go of being, I can't read this, but being, always being in control. So it has these things. So if I read all those out. If you were to pick one that resonates most with you, which one would it be?
I just wanted to go back to one thing that you said around incentivizing, right?
Yeah.
I talked to an organization this week, new client, that is starting to incentivize around not only goals and objectives, as every organization does, but they're actually taking it in a really interesting direction that shows the importance of evolving their culture. So they are incentivizing around components of psychological safety. Like, is the leader demonstrating vulnerability? They're actually putting that in performance. So how cool is that?
That's beautiful.
One that resonates with me, numbing. What's that? The third one, numbing and powerlessness.
Yeah, numbing and powerlessness.
I think that I have a tendency to go down that perfectionism route. I'm going to be candid.
Yeah.
And like your example of staying up until your eyeballs are falling out, like I have a tendency to do that, or getting up at ridiculous times just because I want to look at it one more time. I want to make sure that I'm overly prepared. One of the things I think we need to go into as we're starting to think about closing out the episode is like, what do we do about that? So I just talked about perfectionism, and one of the antidotes for me around feeling worthy is to over prepare. I do think that for our watchers and listeners, viewers, that one recommend I would have is, if you're feeling any of these things, you're into a new job and I don't know if I can do it, that preparation can actually help kind of ease that beast within. You might even consider doing your own personal SWOT analysis, right? So when we talk about looking inward, we can do that through assessment. We can do that through a SWOT. What are some recommends that you have in terms of overcoming the imposter experience?
Well, for any of those guideposts, there are antidotes, and the book does get into them. Perfectionism as one, we would want to cultivate. So based on Brené's research, we would want to cultivate self-compassion. And one of the self-compassion resources that she touches on in her work is the work of Dr. Kristin Neff that touches on 3 different components of self-compassion around self-kindness versus self-judgment, common humanity versus isolation, mindfulness versus, over-identification, being swept away by the negativity. So, that's just one example where we can self-identify and then look at its antidote and what we can cultivate instead, because it's acknowledging that we're all unique. So she's clustered it into themes based on her research. So which one do you identify with? What are the top 2? There's also a resource. She has what's called the Wholehearted Inventory, and it's on brenebrown.com/wholehearted inventory /. And it takes like a matter of minutes, and you can find out, just answer the questions and find out which ones are you the most of or the least of, and then you can get into some of this. So there are some amazing resources out there that are accessible and free. I have other ideas. How about you?
I think, we've talked about this in episode 1, where we talk about ourselves as children. I think that was episode 1. I haven't yet met a child that had the imposter experience, right? They're humble, they're curious. So I would say, go back. And do you still have the picture of you as a little girl on your,
Yeah, you?
It's such a great reminder, right? I don't. I'm totally going to do that though, because it's a great reminder of how we get socialized into being another. And our job in this universe is to be authentically who we are. So I love that quote around Brené Brown, a Simon Sinek quote to counter yours, is to be authentic is to be at peace with our imperfections.
Yeah.
We're all human beings living the human experience. We are not perfect. Perfect doesn't exist. If it does, please let us know, because we want to interview it.
Yeah.
And so I think constantly go back to who am I? Who was I as a kid? We didn't do all this stuff to ourselves as children, right? Yeah. And I think it's a reminder that and actually external forces that can, and our internal forces that are perpetuating a lot of this.
Yeah, I'm with you. It's funny, as I just intervened, I used the word actually, and I'm like, oh, that's a communication shrinker. The image of a child is one of the means of accessing our self-compassion, and is also a means of accessing empathy for another person. Imagining that bobble-headed little toddler when somebody kind of lights your fire, and it can diffuse. That image of a child is very, very powerful. And I'm with you that there's so much in the environment. And so how do we still stand tall when we're in environments that can groom us otherwise? And that, I think, is one of the single biggest, most compelling opportunities in this. I really think a lot of it is also in, I wrote a few notes on what I think the core of it all is. And I think it's self-love. I really do. A quote from Brené Brown: "I'm worthy now, not if, not when. We are worthy of love and belonging now, right this minute, as is."
I love ya, Eva.
But I didn't write that. It's on page 24, but it
resonated with you. And I think you even sent me an email with that quote on it. So I think you're right. It comes down to self-love and being kind to ourselves, right? Yeah. We talk a lot about being kind to others. At Talk, kindness is the secret sauce to organizational transformation. I really believe that. But kindness to ourselves.
Yeah. And I think where we get into the grip in the moment, I think it's also just growing that awareness, noticing it, taking pause, intercepting it, go for a walk, breathe deeply, focus on the belly breathing, a mindfulness moment, and explore what might be an alternative. Own the story, stand outside of the story, and grow the capacity to explore positive alternatives or reflect on past experiences that got you through these moments. Some of that process, a gentleman by the name of Carson, who wrote a masterclass in gremlin taming, just being in process. It doesn't go away, but we can tame it by being in process, noticing it, intercepting it, taking pause. So, speaking of pause, I think, and one other thing because we touched on self-compassion. Anybody interested to dig into the work of Dr. Kristen Neff, you can go to self-compassion.org. There are, if you want to dig into a bit more of the self-love, so much of it starts with self-compassion. And so she's actually got a little quiz on there, a little assessment you can do, and then a heap of amazing resources. So I'll pause there. I know we need to close it out. anything final on the topic before we?
I think we did it. I think we did it again.
I know. It reminds me, oops, we did it again. I guess mug draw, same goes. There's no secret sauce here. Share your comments on YouTube. Share what you're curious about or what really resonated with you. We'd love to hear it. We do just ask that it is we keep our commentary together, candid, honest, and psychologically safe in that zone. And also stay tuned. Episode 9 is coming out hot and soon. And as Carolyn said, we do these monthly. So stay tuned and don't miss it by subscribing on the YouTube channel. If you want to keep putting the
please click the button.
Click the button.
Click the button.
Yeah, you'll know.
Ding, ding, click the button.
So make sure to subscribe. And if you want some funk and disco, go to Spotify, just look up Pithy Musings and bada bing, bada boom, ta-da, you have a playlist, you can dance. You too could have disco balls just like us. If you have feedback, ideas, or questiones, you can reach out to Carolyn at talktalk.ca. You can reach out to me at livewithfervor.com and get ready. Until next time, stay pithy.
Stay pithy. Keep musing. Thanks, Eva.
Thank you.